Rain hammered against the windshield like 1,000 tiny fists demanding entrance, and Eleanor tightened her grip on the steering wheel as her ancient Honda crawled along the empty highway. The fundraiser had run late, parents lingering over wine and promises to donate more than they could afford, while she smiled until her face ached and pretended the school's financial crisis wasn't partially her own. Her checking account held $47 until Friday. The gas light had been on for 3 miles. She just needed to make it home, crawl into bed, and forget this entire exhausting night existed. The curve appeared suddenly through the downpour, sharper than she remembered, and then she saw it. The wreckage. A black sedan wrapped around an oak tree like a lover's embrace turned violent, metal twisted into shapes metal should never take, glass scattered across asphalt like scattered diamonds under her headlights. Her foot hit the brake before her mind fully processed what she was seeing. Every instinct screamed at her to keep driving, to pretend she saw nothing, because stopping on deserted roads in the middle of nowhere was how women ended up on true crime podcasts. But her car was already slowing, already pulling onto the shoulder, because beneath the fear was something else entirely. The knowledge that someone inside that destruction might still be breathing, might still be saved. She killed the engine, grabbed her phone. The rain soaked through her cardigan within seconds as she ran toward the wreck, her flat slipping on wet pavement, her heart a wild thing trying to escape her chest. The driver's side door was crumpled inward, but the passenger side hung open at an unnatural angle. She peered inside and her breath caught. A man, unconscious, blood everywhere. It sheeted down his face from a gash near his temple, soaked through his white shirt until the fabric clung to his chest, pooled on the leather seat beneath him. So much blood. Too much blood. Her hands shook as she dialed 911, as she gave the location, as the dispatcher told her to check if he was breathing. She reached through the shattered window, pressed trembling fingers to his throat, and felt the flutter of pulse beneath cold skin. Alive. Barely. The dispatcher was talking, telling her to apply pressure to visible wounds, and Eleanor was moving on autopilot, yanking off her cardigan and pressing it against the worst of the bleeding on his side where something had torn through fabric and flesh. His blood was hot against her cold hands, pulsing with stubborn life, and she pressed harder, whispering things she would not remember later. Promises that help was coming, pleas that he hold on. The minutes stretched like hours until sirens finally wailed in the distance, growing closer, and red and blue lights painted the rain in carnival colors. Paramedics swarmed the scene with practiced efficiency, extracting the man from the wreckage with careful speed, while one of them checked Eleanor over despite her protests. A young paramedic with kind eyes noticed her medical alert bracelet when taking her vitals. AB negative. He glanced at his partner, then back at her. The man was critical. Massive blood loss. They needed her type desperately. Would she come to the hospital and donate? Eleanor looked at the stretcher where they were loading the stranger whose blood still stained her hands, whose life had somehow become tangled with hers on this terrible night, and she heard herself say yes without hesitation, climbing into the ambulance as it screamed toward the city and whatever waited there. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The donation room was too bright, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like insects trapped behind plastic, and Eleanor sat in the padded chair while a nurse with tired eyes inserted the needle into her arm with practiced efficiency. The sting barely registered through the numbness that had settled over her like a second skin. Shock wrapped around her thoughts, and muffling everything except the persistent replay of twisted metal and too much blood. She watched her blood flow through the clear tube, dark red and impossibly vital, traveling toward machines that would prepare it for the stranger whose pulse she had felt failing beneath her fingertips. The nurse patted her shoulder and murmured something about bravery, about saving a life, and Eleanor wanted to laugh because she felt anything but brave. She felt hollowed out and shaky, running on adrenaline that was rapidly deserting her. Dr. Whitmore appeared sometime later. A lean man in his 50s with silver threading through dark hair and the kind eyes of someone who had seen too much suffering to be anything but gentle. He shook her hand, his grip warm and steady, and told her that her quick action at the scene combined with her donation had saved the patient. He was stable now, in ICU, expected to recover fully. She should be proud. Eleanor nodded because words seemed too complicated, too heavy to lift from her throat to her mouth. She just wanted to leave, to go home, to shower away the blood still crusted under her fingernails, and pretend tonight had never happened. Dr. Whitmore insisted she rest for at least 30 minutes, drink the juice they provided, let her body recover from the donation before she drove anywhere. She agreed because arguing took energy she no longer possessed and settled back into the chair with a cup of apple juice that tasted like sugar and chemicals. The donation room had windows overlooking the corridor, and through them she watched the hospital's late-night rhythm, nurses moving with quiet purpose, a janitor pushing a mop bucket, and then something else entirely. Men in suits, expensive suits, the kind she recognized from parent-teacher conferences with the wealthiest families, dark fabric that probably cost more than her monthly rent. They moved differently than hospital staff, with a coiled alertness that made her think of predators circling territory. They clustered near the ICU entrance, speaking in hushed tones to someone she could not see, and there were too many of them for a normal patient. She caught fragments when a nurse passed through the door, words that made no sense together. Protection detail, liability, containment. Her exhaustion made everything surreal, painted strangeness over ordinary things, and she told herself she was imagining the tension, the way hospital staff seemed nervous around those men, the inappropriate presence of what looked like private security in a public hospital. Shock did strange things to perception, made patterns where none existed. Dr. Whitmore returned to check on her, and she asked about the patient, some instinct she could not name making her need to know. The doctor's expression shifted, became carefully neutral, and he said only that the patient was stable and she had done a remarkable thing. Nothing more. When he finally cleared her to leave, dawn was breaking over the city, pale light washing the parking lot in shades of gray and pink. Eleanor walked to her Honda on legs that trembled with fatigue, climbed inside, and sat for a long moment with her hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. She wanted only to forget this entire terrible night, to let it fade into the background noise of her ordinary life. She had no way of knowing that forgetting would not be permitted, that she had saved someone whose gratitude would prove more dangerous than his death ever could have been. 3 days passed in a haze of normalcy that felt like a lie, Eleanor throwing herself into lesson plans and parent emails and the comfortable rhythms of classroom routine while trying to convince herself that the night of the accident was already fading into memory, already becoming just another strange story she would tell at dinner parties she never attended. The children were practicing for the spring concert, their off-key singing filling the classroom with chaotic joy, and she smiled and corrected pitch and pretended her hands did not still remember the heat of a stranger's blood. She stayed late grading papers, putting off the return to her apartment because exhaustion was easier than thought, and the sun was setting when she finally pulled into her building's parking lot and saw it. The car, black and sleek and expensive, so out of place among the dented Hondas and rusting Toyotas that it might as well have been a panther among house cats, and her stomach dropped even before the man emerged from the driver's side. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled his tailored charcoal suit in ways that suggested the fabric was custom-made for his frame, and he moved with the fluid economy of someone trained in violence, even though his expression was professionally neutral. He approached as she stood frozen beside her car, keys digging into her palm, every instinct screaming danger. His face was handsome in a harsh way, all sharp angles and cold assessment, dark hair cropped close and eyes that catalogued her like she was a problem requiring a specific solution. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice deep and cultured, not a question but a confirmation. "My name is Marcus Thornhill, and I represent Mr. Alexander Ravenscroft, who wishes to meet with you to express his gratitude personally for your actions 3 nights ago." The words were polite, carefully constructed, but underneath them ran a current of absolute certainty that his request would be honored. Eleanor found her voice, shaky but determined. "I don't want to meet anyone. I was glad to help, but I don't need thanks. Please tell Mr. Ravenscroft that." Marcus regarded her with something that might have been sympathy on a less controlled face. "Mr. Ravenscroft does not make requests lightly. He has asked me to invite you to dinner tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock. She stepped backward, her spine hitting her car. "I'm not going to dinner with a stranger. Thank him for me, but no, I have to go inside now." She tried to move past him, but he shifted slightly, not blocking her but making his presence impossible to ignore, and produced a heavy cream business card from his jacket pocket. "The address and time are here. Mr. Ravenscroft would consider it a personal favor." His tone made it clear that refusing a personal favor from Alexander Ravenscroft was not something people did, not if they valued their continued comfort. Eleanor took the card because refusing seemed more dangerous than accepting, the expensive paper heavy between her fingers. "What if I don't come?" Marcus's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Mr. Ravenscroft doesn't take no for an answer, Miss Ashford. I suggest you reconsider." He returned to the black car and drove away before she could form a response, leaving her standing in the parking lot with a business card that felt like a summons, and a growing sense that her life had just tilted sideways into territory she did not understand. That night she called Catherine, her best friend since college, and explained everything in a breathless rush while pacing her tiny living room. There was a long silence on the other end before Catherine spoke, her voice tight with fear. "Ellie, Alexander Ravenscroft is not some businessman grateful for a favor. He runs half the organized crime in this city. He's dangerous. You can't go." But Eleanor stared at the card on her coffee table and knew with sickening certainty that she had no choice at all, that whatever she had started on that rainy highway had set something in motion that would not be easily stopped, and the trap had already closed around her before she even knew she was prey. The penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower that Eleanor had seen from the highway 1,000 times without ever imagining she would stand inside it, and the elevator ride felt endless, her stomach dropping with each floor they climbed, while a silent security guard stood beside her like a well-dressed statue. She had dressed carefully, her nicest dress, navy blue and modest, paired with the heels she wore to parent conferences, armor that felt pitifully inadequate against whatever awaited her above. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse, no hallway to buffer the transition, and she stepped into a space so vast and pristine it felt more like a museum than a home. All floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering city and furniture that probably cost more than she earned in a year. Another guard gestured toward the living room, a sprawling area anchored by a fireplace that burned despite the mild evening, and that was where she saw him. Alexander Ravenscroft stood with his back to the windows, backlit by the city he controlled, and Eleanor's breath caught despite every intention to remain unaffected. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than she had expected, wearing black trousers and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows in a concession to casualness that somehow made him more intimidating rather than less. But it was his face that stopped her, the kind of face that would make anyone look twice, all strong bones and sharp angles softened only slightly by a mouth that looked like it rarely smiled. His hair was dark, shorter on the sides and slightly longer on top, styled with careless precision, and his eyes, when they locked onto hers, were the pale gray of winter storms and just as cold. He watched her with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare, catalogued, assessed, and she forced herself to walk forward on legs that trembled beneath her dress. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice low and controlled, textured like smoke. "Thank you for coming." She nodded because words required breath she did not have, her heart hammering against her ribs like something caged and desperate. He moved toward her with predatory grace, each step measured, and gestured to the seating area. "Please, sit." She perched on the edge of a leather chair that probably cost more than her car, her hands clasped tight in her lap, and he settled onto the sofa across from her, close enough that she could see the faint scar cutting through his left eyebrow and the way his gaze never wavered from her face. "I wanted to thank you personally for saving my life. Your actions that night were extraordinary." His words were formal, but something in his tone suggested genuine gratitude beneath the control. She found her voice, smaller than she wanted. Anyone would have done the same. His mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile. "No, Miss Ashford, they would not have. Most people would have driven past. You stopped. You helped. You gave your own blood. That is not common." She shifted under his scrutiny, unnerved by the way he watched her like she was a puzzle he intended to solve. "I'm glad you're recovering, Mr. Ravenscroft, but I really don't need thanks. I should go." He leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on his knees, and the movement brought him closer into her space. "Tell me about yourself. You're a teacher. Elementary school." The abrupt shift confused her. "Yes, 3rd grade. Why does that matter?" "It matters because you matter. You saved my life, and I know nothing about you except your name and your remarkable courage. Do you enjoy teaching?" The question felt absurd given the circumstances, but his focus demanded answer. "Yes, I love it. The children are wonderful. Now, can I please leave?" He ignored her request. "You live alone, drive a 2012 Honda, volunteer at a literacy nonprofit on weekends. You're struggling financially, but you donated blood without hesitation. Why?" Anger flared through her fear. "Have you been investigating me? That's invasive and wrong. I came here because your associate made it clear I had no choice, but I don't owe you my life story." His expression did not change, but something flickered in those pale eyes. Respect, maybe, or interest. "I apologize if my inquiries made you uncomfortable. I needed to understand who you are. Please, allow me to offer compensation for your help." He reached into his pocket and produced a check, already filled out, and slid it across the table. Eleanor glanced down and her vision blurred. $5,000. She stood abruptly, fury overwhelming caution. "I don't want your money. I didn't help you for payment. Keep it." His expression shifted, surprise crossing his features before something darker replaced it, something hungry and focused. He rose slowly, towering over her, and for the first time since entering she saw the danger everyone warned about, the predator beneath the polished surface. That refusal, spoken with shaking conviction, had changed something fundamental, and his pale eyes burned with an intensity that terrified and inexplicably thrilled her in equal measure. Alexander moved closer, and the space between them evaporated like water on hot stone, his presence overwhelming in ways that had nothing to do with physical size and everything to do with the barely leashed intensity radiating from him like heat from a furnace. "You do not understand, Miss Ashford. In my world, debts are not abstract concepts to be dismissed with polite refusals. They are obligations, bindings, matters of honor and survival. I owe you my life, and that debt must be repaid." His voice had dropped lower, rough velvet that scraped along her nerves and made her acutely aware of how alone they were in this fortress of glass and steel. She forced herself to hold his gaze, even as her heart threw itself against her ribs hard enough to bruise. "I do not want anything from your world, Mr. Ravenscroft. I live a normal life, a safe life, and I would like to keep it that way. Please just let this go. Let me go." Something flickered across his expression, Gone too quickly to name, but it looked almost like pain before his features settled back into controlled neutrality. You think you can just walk away, resume your teaching and your modest apartment, and pretend you never pulled me from that wreck. His hand lifted, and for one breathless moment, she thought he might touch her face, but instead he gestured to the windows behind him, to the glittering city sprawling below. There are people out there who already know what you did, who see you as leverage or threat or opportunity. You saved me, and in doing so you made yourself visible, relevant. Do you understand what that means? Terror spiked cold through her bloodstream, but she channeled it into anger because fury was safer than fear. That is not my fault. I did not ask for any of this. You cannot just insert yourself into my life because you have some misguided sense of obligation. His jaw tightened, and he stepped closer still, near enough now that she could smell his cologne, something dark and expensive like cedar and smoke, and see the faint shadows under his eyes that suggested he slept as poorly as she had these past nights. I always repay my debts, Miss Ashford. Always. Whether you accept money or protection or favors, the debt exists. It is a fact like gravity. You can refuse to acknowledge it, but that will not make it disappear. She tilted her head back to maintain eye contact, refusing to retreat even though every instinct screamed at her to put distance between them, and the defiance must have shown on her face because his eyes narrowed with something that looked disturbingly like approval. Then consider your debt paid by my refusal. I absolve you of obligation. We are even. Now I am leaving. She tried to step around him, but his hand caught her wrist, not hard but immovable, his fingers warm against her pulse point where her heartbeat galloped wild and frantic. Not even, he murmured, his thumb pressing against the vulnerable skin of her inner wrist, like he was counting each terrified beat of her heart. Not nearly even. But I can see you need time to understand the situation you are in. Go home, Eleanor. Think about what I have offered. We will speak again soon. The use of her first name felt shockingly intimate, and she pulled her wrist free, stumbling back a step, while his hand fell slowly to his side. His expression had shifted into something unreadable, controlled again, but with heat simmering beneath the surface like magma under stone, and she knew with absolute certainty that he meant every word, that this was not over, would not be over until he decided it was. She fled without another word, her heels clicking sharp against marble as she walked too fast toward the elevator, while feeling his gaze track her every step, like a predator watching prey decide whether to run. And when the elevator doors finally closed between them, she sagged against the wall and tried to remember how to breathe around the fear and the unwanted, unforgivable flicker of attraction that burned hot and terrifying in her chest. Eleanor threw herself into the familiar rhythms of her classroom with desperate determination, teaching fractions and reading comprehension to 28 eight-year-olds as if normalcy could be reclaimed through sheer force of will. But the illusion shattered every time she glanced through the window and saw the black sedan parked across the street from the school, always there when she arrived, and still there when she left. The first day she told herself it was coincidence, paranoia born from a stressful encounter. But by the third day, the pattern was undeniable, and the knot of anxiety in her stomach had twisted into something harder and hotter, anger burning through the fear like acid eating through metal. The car followed her to the grocery store, maintaining a careful distance but never disappearing, and when she stopped by Catherine's apartment that evening, her friend took one look at her face and poured wine without asking. "You look terrified," Catherine said, settling onto the couch beside her. "What happened after you met him?" "Everything," Eleanor answered, "and nothing. He just will not let this go. And now I think I am being followed." Catherine's expression shifted from concern to alarm. "Followed? Eleanor, you need to call the police or move or something. This is not okay." "The police cannot help against someone like Ravenscroft," Eleanor said bitterly. "And where would I move that he could not find me? You said yourself he controls this city." The helplessness tasted like copper on her tongue, and she hated it. hated him for making her feel powerless in her own life. The surveillance continued, black cars appearing near her apartment building in the mornings, and Marcus Thornhill's distinctive tall frame occasionally visible in her periphery when she ran errands, never approaching, but always present, like a well-dressed shadow she could not shake. By the end of the week, rage had burned through most of her fear, and when she spotted Marcus standing near the school parking lot, as she walked to her car, she changed direction and marched straight toward him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, and her heart hammering with adrenaline. "Tell Ravenscroft to leave me alone," she demanded without preamble. "Tell him I do not want his protection or his attention or whatever this is. Just tell him to stop." Marcus regarded her with those impassive dark eyes, his expression revealing nothing. And when he spoke, his voice was calm and measured. "Mr. Ravenscroft is ensuring your safety, Miss Ashford, nothing more." "Safety from what?" she snapped. "From him, because he is the only threat in my life right now." Marcus's expression did not change, but something flickered behind his eyes, something that might have been sympathy or warning. "Not from him," he said quietly, and then turned and walked away before she could demand explanation, leaving her standing alone in the parking lot with more questions than answers, and fury still burning hot in her chest. That night she returned to her apartment to find 2 bags of expensive groceries sitting outside her door, items she would never buy herself, organic produce and imported pasta and wine that probably cost more than her weekly food budget. And tucked between the bags was a small card with handwriting she recognized from the check she had refused, bold strokes in black ink that read, "You should not struggle, let me help." Eleanor crumpled the note in her fist and left the groceries in the hallway, slamming her door hard enough to rattle the frame. But even as anger flooded through her, she could not ignore the traitorous flutter of something else beneath it, something dangerous and unwanted that whispered he was thinking of her, noticing her needs, refusing to let her go. Eleanor discovered the vandalism on a Thursday morning when she walked to her car parked in the apartment building lot, her arms full of papers to grade and her mind already on the spelling test she needed to administer first period. But all those ordinary concerns evaporated like morning frost when she saw the words spray-painted across her driver's side door in jagged red letters that looked like blood in the early light. "Stay away from Ravenscroft or else." Her papers scattered across the pavement as shock turned her fingers numb and her breath came too fast, shallow gasps that made her lightheaded while she stared at the threat and tried to process that this was real, that someone hated her enough or feared her connection to Alexander enough to do this. She called the police with shaking hands, and 2 officers arrived 20 minutes later, young men who took photos and filled out a report with expressions that shifted from professional concern to barely concealed nervousness when she explained that the Ravenscroft mentioned was Alexander Ravenscroft, and she saw them exchange a glance that confirmed what she already knew, that police protection meant nothing against the kind of enemies a man like Alexander collected. They promised to increase patrols in her neighborhood, but their voices lacked conviction, and after they left, she sat in her apartment with the door locked and blinds drawn, too frightened to go to work and too angry to cry, fury and terror braiding together in her chest until she could not distinguish one from the other. Catherine came over immediately when Eleanor called, took one look at her face and wrapped her in a fierce hug that finally broke something loose. And Eleanor found herself shaking against her friend's shoulder, while rage poured out in bitter words about how Alexander had destroyed her life just by existing in it, how she had tried to do the right thing, and now someone wanted to hurt her for it. Evening came with long shadows stretching across her living room floor, and Catherine had just convinced her to eat something when a sharp knock sounded at the door, authoritative and demanding, and Eleanor knew before she checked the peephole that it would be him. Alexander stood in the hallway looking like controlled fury given human form, his expression carved from ice and his eyes burning with cold fire when she opened the door, and he did not wait for invitation before stepping inside and closing the door behind him with careful precision that somehow felt more dangerous than if he had slammed it. "I heard what happened," he said, his voice low and hard like stone grinding against stone. "Show me the photos." She wanted to refuse, to order him out, but something in his face made her pull up the images on her phone, and when his eyes fixed on the spray-painted threat, his jaw tightened, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Catherine watched from the couch with wide eyes while Alexander studied the photos, with the focused intensity of a predator calculating angles of attack, and when he finally looked up at Eleanor, his expression had shifted into something almost apologetic beneath the fury. "This is my fault," he said quietly. "Helping me made you visible to people who want to hurt me through anyone I value, and now they see you as leverage or target, or both." The confirmation of her worst fear should have brought satisfaction, but instead Eleanor felt only hollow despair because hearing him accept responsibility did not change anything, did not make her safer or return her normal life. "Get out," she said, her voice shaking with exhaustion and anger. "Just get out and leave me alone, because this only gets worse as long as you are in my life." He looked at her for a long moment, and something that might have been pain flickered across his features before his expression hardened back into implacable determination. "No," he said simply, "I will not leave you unprotected, and I will not let them use you to hurt me. You have guards outside your building as of now, and I am going to find whoever did this and make sure they never threaten you again." She realized with creeping horror that she had lost all control of her own life, that her choices no longer mattered because Alexander Ravenscroft had decided to protect her, and nothing she said would change his mind. The fire started at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday night, smoke detectors screaming through the building and sending Eleanor stumbling from sleep into chaos, the acrid smell of burning filling her apartment while she grabbed her phone and keys with shaking hands and fled down the stairwell with her neighbors, all of them coughing and terrified as firefighters swarmed the building and the night sky glowed orange with flames that seemed to concentrate around the third floor where her apartment sat. She stood on the sidewalk in her pajamas and bare feet watching everything she owned threatened by fire, and when the fire chief told her 40 minutes later that the blaze appeared to have been deliberately set near her door. Specifically, she felt the last fragile threads of her normal life burn away with the smoke still rising into the dark sky. Alexander arrived before dawn with Marcus and 2 other men, his face carved from granite and his eyes sweeping over her with an intensity that felt almost physical, checking for injury with a thoroughness that made her simultaneously grateful and resentful. And when he told her she was coming with him to somewhere safe, she opened her mouth to refuse. But he continued speaking in that low, controlled voice that somehow brooked no argument, saying this was no longer about her pride or independence, because whoever wanted her dead had just tried to burn her alive, and he would not stand by and wait for them to succeed. She refused anyway, clinging to the illusion of choice, even as Catherine arrived with clothes and shoes, and the look on her best friend's face told Eleanor that Catherine agreed with Alexander, that staying meant dying. The final thread of her resistance snapped 2 days later, when Catherine called her sobbing to say someone had tampered with her car's brake lines and she had nearly crashed on the highway. And Eleanor knew, with sick certainty, that her stubbornness was putting everyone she loved in danger, that Alexander's enemies would hurt anyone connected to her to prove a point, or draw her out, or simply because they could. She called the number on the card Marcus had left and said simply, "I will come." And 3 hours later, she was sitting in a black SUV with windows tinted so dark, the world outside disappeared, driving through streets she did not recognize toward a destination Alexander would not name, her entire life compressed into 2 hastily packed bags, and the hollow feeling in her chest where autonomy used to live. The estate revealed itself gradually as they passed through iron gates and wound up a long tree-lined drive, a sprawling stone mansion that looked like something from a different century, beautiful and cold and utterly impenetrable, exactly like the man who owned it. Marcus escorted her to a bedroom on the second floor that was larger than her entire apartment had been, decorated in soft grays and creams, with French doors opening onto a balcony that overlooked manicured gardens, luxurious and lovely and utterly wrong because she had not chosen this, had been driven here by fear and violence and the inexorable will of a man who collected debts and paid them whether she wanted him to or not. Alexander appeared at her door that evening as she stood staring out at the grounds, trying not to feel like a prisoner in a gilded cage, and when she turned to face him, she saw something unexpected in his expression beneath the careful control. Genuine concern mixed with what might have been regret, and his voice was softer than she had ever heard it when he asked if she had everything she needed, if the room was acceptable, if she was hurt or afraid, questions that suggested he actually cared about the answers rather than simply going through motions of courtesy. And despite her anger, despite her resentment, despite every rational reason to hate him, she found herself noticing the shadows under his eyes and the tension in his shoulders, and realizing that this situation cost him something too, that protecting her created complications in his dangerous world that she could only begin to imagine. Eleanor found herself unable to sleep on the fifth night at the estate, her mind too restless and the silence too heavy, so she slipped from her room wearing pajama pants and an old university sweatshirt and wandered the dimly lit hallways with no destination in mind, just the need to move and think and escape the feeling of being trapped even in luxury. The house felt different at night, less intimidating and more melancholy somehow, shadows pooling in corners and moonlight filtering through tall windows to paint everything in shades of silver and gray, and she let her feet carry her down unfamiliar corridors until she noticed light spilling from beneath a door at the end of the east wing, warm and golden and inviting in the surrounding darkness. She knew she should turn back, return to her room in the safety of distance, but curiosity pulled her forward, and she eased the door open to find Alexander sitting behind a massive desk in what was clearly his private study, his jacket discarded and shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, and his dark hair disheveled as though he had run his hands through it repeatedly, surrounded by papers and ledgers and the weight of an empire that showed clearly in the exhaustion etched across his features. He looked up sharply at the sound of the door, and for a moment she saw something raw and unguarded in his expression, before his usual control slid back into place, but not quite completely. Not enough to hide the weariness that made him look older than 35, made him look almost human. "I could not sleep," she said quietly, and realized it sounded like an apology when she had not meant it to be. "Neither can I," he replied, gesturing to the papers before him with something that might have been resignation. "There is always another problem to solve, and another threat to neutralize, and it never ends." She should have left then, but instead found herself stepping into the room and closing the door behind her, moving closer to see what consumed him, and discovering detailed reports about territorial disputes and supply chain issues, and encrypted messages about people who wanted him dead. The machinery of violence and power laid bare in black ink and clinical language. "This is your life," she said, not quite a question, managing all of this. He nodded slowly, and something in his posture shifted, the rigid control easing just slightly, as though her presence allowed him to set down some invisible burden he always carried. "I inherited this world from my father, who got it from his father before him," he said, his voice low and stripped of its usual commanding edge, "and I have spent 15 years trying to make it less bloody while keeping everyone alive and holding territory against men who see mercy as weakness." The admission surprised her with its honesty, and she found herself sitting in the leather chair across from his desk, her earlier resentment complicated by this glimpse of the impossible game he played every day, the endless calculations between violence and survival. She told him then about her own losses, her parents dying in a car accident when she was 22, and how she had chosen teaching because children still believed the world could be good and she needed to believe it too, how loneliness had become so familiar she barely noticed it anymore, until it occasionally rose up and threatened to drown her in the middle of ordinary moments. They talked for 2 hours about things that mattered and things that did not, The conversation winding through childhood memories and present fears, and the strange spaces between who they had been and who they had become. And when she finally stood to leave, his hand caught hers, his fingers warm and strong and gentle, and neither of them pulled away while something dangerous and inevitable stretched between them like a live wire humming with current. The touch lasted only seconds but felt like longer, felt like a threshold crossed, and when she finally slipped her hand free and left his study, she could still feel the heat of his skin against hers. The 3 days after that night in the study felt like moving through water. Everything slowed and waited with awareness. Eleanor catching Alexander's eyes on her during breakfast and feeling heat rise in her throat, their hands brushing when he passed her documents about estate security, and the contact lingering a half-second too long, conversations taking on double meanings where innocuous words about dinner plans or weather somehow became charged with everything they were not saying about the current running between them that grew stronger each time they occupied the same room. She told herself it was proximity and danger creating false intimacy, that she was confusing gratitude and protection for something deeper, but the lies tasted bitter, even in the privacy of her own mind, because she knew what desire felt like, and this was desire. Raw and undeniable and terrifying in its intensity, attraction to a man whose hands had certainly killed and whose world operated by rules that would destroy everything she had believed about morality and safety and the kind of life she wanted. The assassination attempt happened on a Thursday afternoon while she stood in the garden cutting roses that Marcus had told her were safe to enjoy. The crack of a rifle shot splitting the air and sending her stumbling backward as the stone fountain beside her exploded in a spray of granite chips and water, her mind blank with shock as two of Alexander's guards materialized from nowhere and tackled her to the ground, while others returned fire toward the tree line, and Marcus shouted commands into his radio, calling for lockdown and perimeter sweep. They rushed her inside through the chaos, her dress torn and knees scraped from the gravel, and her hands shaking so violently she could not control them, adrenaline flooding her system and making the world feel simultaneously razor-sharp and distant, sounds too loud and colors too bright, while they secured her in her bedroom and checked for injuries with clinical efficiency before leaving her alone with instructions not to move from the room until Alexander himself gave clearance. She sat on the edge of her bed trying to breathe through the panic, trying to process how close death had come, how the bullet had missed her head by perhaps 18 inches, how she had been picking flowers, and now someone wanted her dead badly enough to try this in daylight on secured grounds. And when Alexander burst through her door 20 minutes later, with fury and fear warring across his features, she looked up at him, and something inside her cracked open. He crossed to her in 3 long strides, his hands framing her face with surprising gentleness, considering the violence in his eyes, and he searched her expression like he was cataloging every detail to ensure she remained whole and real and alive in front of him. "You are unhurt," he said. And it was not quite a question, but she nodded anyway, because physically she was fine, even though inside she felt like she was shattering. "They could have killed you," he continued, his voice dropping to something rough and raw. "They could have taken you from me." The possessiveness in those words should have frightened her, but instead it ignited something desperate, and she reached for him without thinking, her hands fisting in his shirt as she pulled him down and kissed him with all the fear and need and frustrated desire that had been building for days. And after one shocked moment, he responded with fierce hunger, his mouth claiming hers with an intensity that stole her breath and made her forget why this was dangerous or wrong or complicated. They kissed like drowning people breaking the surface, desperate and consuming, his hands sliding into her hair and hers exploring the hard muscles of his back through expensive fabric. And when they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard, foreheads pressed together in the charged silence that followed. Eleanor felt overwhelmed by the tangle of emotions coursing through her, desire and fear and anger at herself for wanting him this much, for letting him under her defenses when she knew better, when she knew what he was and what loving him would cost. Alexander looked equally shaken, his careful control stripped away to reveal vulnerability and want, and something that looked almost like pain. "I should not have done that," he said roughly, but made no move to step away. She could not find words, so she just shook her head, uncertain if she was agreeing or disagreeing, knowing only that everything had changed, and there was no path back to the careful distance they had been maintaining. Eleanor woke the next morning with the memory of Alexander's kiss still burning on her lips, and found herself unable to face him at breakfast. So she stayed in her room until nearly noon, when restlessness finally drove her out into the hallways, where she wandered aimlessly trying to sort through the chaos of her emotions, the way desire and fear and something dangerously close to trust had tangled together into a knot she could not unpick. She was passing near Alexander's study when she heard voices, his and Marcus's, speaking in the low tones that meant business rather than casual conversation, and she knew she should keep walking, but something in Marcus's words stopped her cold, the phrase using her as bait carrying clearly through the partially open door. Eleanor froze in the corridor, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs as she stepped closer to hear better, despite knowing eavesdropping would show her things she might not want to see. Marcus was saying that Victor Drummond would never surface unless they gave him irresistible incentive, that the girl was perfect for it since Drummond already knew about her and saw her as Alexander's weakness. And she heard papers rustling before Alexander responded in a voice so cold it sent ice through her veins, telling Marcus the timeline needed adjustment and asking about security protocols for the setup. She felt the words like physical blows, each one confirming her worst fear that she had been right to keep her distance, that Alexander's protection and attention had been manipulation all along, that the kiss and the vulnerability and everything she had started to believe about him had been calculated moves in whatever game he played with men like Victor Drummond. Eleanor must have made some sound, because suddenly the conversation stopped, and the door swung fully open to reveal Alexander standing there with an expression that shifted from surprise to something harder when he saw her face. "You are using me," she said, and her voice sounded strange and distant even to her own ears. "All of this has been about drawing out your enemy, and I have been stupid enough to think it was real." Alexander's jaw tightened, and he glanced at Marcus, who had the grace to look uncomfortable before he stepped into the hallway and tried to reach for her, but she jerked backward like his touch would burn. "Eleanor, let me explain," he began, but she was already shaking her head and backing away, anger rising to replace the hurt, because anger was easier. Anger did not make her feel like a fool who had kissed a man who saw her as a tactical asset rather than a person. She turned and ran, her only thought to get out of this house and away from him, to reclaim some shred of control over a life that had spiraled completely beyond her grasp from the moment she stopped to help a bleeding stranger on a dark road. She made it to the main entrance before Alexander caught her arm and spun her around, and she tried to pull free, but his grip was unbreakable, though not painful, just insistent and desperate in a way that might have moved her if she were not so angry and betrayed. "The plan existed," he said roughly. "I will not lie to you about that, but I abandoned it weeks ago because he gestured between them, because you are not someone I can use and discard, Eleanor." She wanted to believe him, but trust felt impossible when she had just heard him discussing timelines and security protocols with Marcus like she was an operation to be managed. "Let me go," she demanded, her voice breaking on the words. "Just let me leave and find someone else to be bait for your war." His expression turned anguished, and he stepped closer, crowding into her space the way he had that first day in his penthouse. Except now it felt different, felt like pleading rather than intimidation. "I am falling for you," he said, and the confession was raw and unguarded in a way she had never heard from him. "I did not expect it, and I do not want it, because caring for you makes me weak, but I cannot seem to stop, and the thought of you in danger destroys me." Eleanor felt tears burning in her eyes because she wanted desperately to believe him, but belief required a leap of faith she was not sure she could make. Eleanor spent 2 days locked in her room refusing to see Alexander, while her mind spun in circles trying to untangle what was real from what had been strategy, replaying every conversation and touch and vulnerable moment to search for evidence of manipulation. But the truth was, she no longer trusted her own judgment because she had already proven herself a fool for wanting him, despite knowing exactly what he was and what his world demanded. On the third morning, her phone rang with an unknown number, and when she answered a cultured voice she did not recognize, said her name like a question. And when she confirmed, he introduced himself as Victor Drummond and suggested they had mutual interest to discuss regarding Alexander Ravenscroft. Her blood turned cold because she knew that name, had heard it spoken in hushed tones by Alexander's men as the architect of the crash and the source of escalating threats. And Drummond continued smoothly, saying he understood she was being held against her will, and he could offer her safe passage out of the country, plus financial compensation if she provided testimony about Alexander's criminal operations to certain federal contacts he maintained. Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse and hang up, but something made her listen as Drummond painted Alexander as a monster who had killed dozens and destroyed families, and would eventually discard her when she ceased being useful. And he offered her freedom from a cage she had not chosen with protection his organization could guarantee if she cooperated. She told him she needed time to consider, and he gave her 48 hours before the offer expired, his tone suggesting refusal would be inadvisable for her continued health. After disconnecting, Eleanor sat trembling with the phone clutched in her hand, recognizing she had been given exactly what she claimed to want, an exit from this impossible situation and a return to her normal life. Yet the thought of testifying against Alexander made her physically ill in a way that forced her to confront the truth she had been avoiding. She had fallen for him despite every reasonable instinct for self-preservation, had seen past the ruthless exterior to the man who carried impossible weight and made brutal choices to protect those in his care, who had been willing to die shielding her body from bullets, and who looked at her like she was something precious and breakable. He feared damaging with his blood-stained hands. Drummond was offering freedom, but Eleanor recognized he was a different breed of monster entirely, one who orchestrated car crashes and burned buildings with no regard for collateral damage. And the federal testimony would be a death sentence for Alexander, even if it purchased her temporary safety. She realized with startling clarity that she did not want safety if it cost her Alexander, that sometime during these weeks of forced proximity and dangerous attraction, she had made an irrevocable choice about which world she belonged in and who she belonged with. Eleanor stood and walked to Alexander's study, where she found him at his desk, looking like he had not slept, and when he saw her, his expression transformed into something raw and hopeful and terrified all at once. "I need to tell you something," she said, and proceeded to explain Drummond's call and offer while watching Alexander's face darken with cold fury at the threat implicit in the contact. When she finished, he stood slowly and told her she should take the deal, that he would arrange additional protection and ensure she truly stayed safe even if it meant his own arrest. And the selflessness of it broke something in her chest because she understood he was willing to sacrifice everything for her well-being. "I am not taking the deal," Eleanor said quietly. "I am going to help you trap him instead, and we are going to do it my way with my full agency and choice." And Alexander stared at her like she had offered him salvation he did not deserve but desperately wanted. They spent the night planning every detail with Marcus and 3 of Alexander's most trusted men, mapping the meeting location Eleanor had agreed to with Drummond, a public cafe near the waterfront with enough foot traffic to seem safe, but enough sightlines for Alexander's team to position themselves without detection. Eleanor would wear a wire so thin it felt like nothing against her skin, and Alexander insisted on 2 backup extraction points in case the situation deteriorated faster than anticipated, his control fraying at the edges every time he looked at her and seemed to remember she would be walking into danger he could not fully mitigate. The night before the operation, they did not speak much, the weight of what was coming pressing down on both of them until Eleanor went to his room and found him standing at the window staring out at darkness. And when she touched his shoulder, he turned and pulled her against him with desperate intensity, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that tasted like fear and need and something too fierce to name. They made love slowly, every touch deliberate and claiming, Alexander's hands mapping her body like he was memorizing territory he might lose. And afterward, he held her so tightly she could barely breathe and whispered against her hair that if anything happened to her, he would burn the entire city down, and she believed him absolutely. Morning came too quickly, and Eleanor dressed in ordinary clothes, jeans and a sweater that made her look exactly like what she had been before all this. A school teacher, with no connection to organized crime, or the violent chess games men like Alexander and Drummond played with human lives as pieces. Marcus drove her to the cafe and watched her walk inside while Alexander coordinated from a van 2 blocks away, his voice in her earpiece a steady anchor as she ordered coffee and sat at the table Drummond had specified near the back windows. Victor Drummond arrived precisely on time. A handsome man in his 40s with silver threading his dark hair and a smile that never reached his cold eyes, and he sat across from her like they were old friends meeting for a casual conversation rather than enemies negotiating over betrayals and blood. He thanked her for coming and said he knew this must be difficult given her attachment to Alexander, the word attachment delivered with subtle mockery, and Eleanor forced herself to meet his gaze steadily despite her hammering heart. Drummond told her the federal contact was ready to receive her testimony and asked what she had decided, and Eleanor said carefully that she needed guarantees about her safety and her friend Catherine's safety before she agreed to anything, buying time while Alexander's men moved into position around the building. Drummond leaned forward and said something that stopped her breath, that he knew Alexander loved her because men like them only showed weakness for things they could not bear to lose, and he intended to destroy Alexander by taking everything he loved and watching him break before finally killing him. The admission was delivered so casually, it took Eleanor a moment to process the sheer depth of malice it revealed, and she understood with crystalline clarity that this man would never let her live, regardless of what testimony she provided, that she had only ever been a tool to wound Alexander before the final kill. She saw Drummond's hand move toward his jacket, and suddenly everything exploded into chaos. Drummond's men rising from positions throughout the cafe as Alexander's team breached through 2 entrances simultaneously. Gunfire erupting in sharp cracks that sent civilians screaming and diving for cover. Eleanor dropped beneath the table as Drummond lunged for her, his hand catching her arm with bruising force, but she twisted and drove her knee up the way Marcus had taught her in frantic lessons the previous day, connecting hard enough that Drummond's grip loosened and she scrambled backward. The cafe had transformed into a battlefield, bodies moving with lethal purpose, and Eleanor saw Marcus grapple with one of Drummond's men before taking a bullet to the shoulder that spun him sideways. And then Alexander was there, moving through the violence like something unleashed and unstoppable, his focus locked on reaching her with an intensity that was almost frightening. Drummond had recovered and was shouting orders while pulling a weapon, swinging it toward Eleanor, and she grabbed a chair and threw it with all her strength, the impact enough to spoil his aim as the shot went wide and shattered the window behind her. Alexander reached Drummond, and the fight between them was brutal and efficient, 2 predators who understood violence in their bones, and Eleanor saw one of Drummond's men advancing on Alexander's blind side, and without thinking she grabbed a fallen weapon and fired, the recoil shocking through her wrists, the shot catching the man in the leg and dropping him. Alexander used the distraction to disarm Drummond and drive him to the ground, his forearm across Drummond's throat, and suddenly it was over, Alexander's men securing the remaining threats while sirens wailed in the distance. Alexander looked up and found Eleanor across the wreckage of the cafe, their eyes locking, and she saw in his face the terrible fear of how close he had come to losing her. And then he was moving again, crossing to her and pulling her into his arms, his body shaking as he curved around her like a shield, even though the danger had passed. Alexander kept Eleanor pressed against him for long seconds, while chaos resolved around them, his heartbeat thundering against her ear and his arms locked around her body like he could not physically make himself let go, until Marcus approached holding his bleeding shoulder and said quietly that police were 90 seconds out and they needed to move immediately. Alexander pulled back enough to search Eleanor's face with an intensity that felt like a physical touch, his thumb brushing her cheekbone as he asked if she was hurt. And she shook her head, though she was trembling so hard her teeth wanted to chatter. His men moved with practiced efficiency, extracting them through a back exit while sirens screamed closer, and Eleanor caught a glimpse of Drummond being dragged out separately, his face bloodied and his expression poisonous with thwarted rage, and she felt nothing except relief that he would never threaten anyone again. The drive back to the estate passed in a blur, Eleanor wedged between Alexander and Marcus in the back seat, while someone she did not know drove with aggressive precision through back streets, and Alexander held her hand in both of his, like it was something precious he feared losing if his grip loosened even slightly. At the estate, Marcus was taken immediately to the medical suite they apparently maintained for exactly these situations, and Alexander guided Eleanor to his private rooms rather than the guest suite she had been occupying, sitting her on the edge of his massive bed and kneeling in front of her to check for injuries himself. Despite her repeated assurances, she was fine. His hands moved over her arms and shoulders with careful thoroughness, and she realized they were shaking. This man who had moved through gunfire without hesitation was trembling as he touched her, and the evidence of how terrified he had been broke something loose in her chest. She caught his face between her hands and made him look at her, seeing the rawness in his eyes he was not bothering to hide, all his careful control stripped away to reveal the man beneath the armor, and she told him she was safe. They were both safe. It was over. Alexander closed his eyes and leaned his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. He did not try to disguise as he said he had never been so afraid in his entire life as the moment he saw Drummond's weapon swing toward her, that watching her in danger had been worse than any torture he could imagine, and he did not know how to exist in a world where she might be taken from him. Eleanor felt tears burn her eyes because she understood exactly what he was confessing, the depth of feeling he had not wanted and could not control, and she kissed him gently, tasting fear and relief and something too fierce to name. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other while the adrenaline slowly drained and left exhaustion in its wake, until Alexander finally stood and insisted she shower and rest. And when she emerged clean and wearing one of his shirts because her clothes were ruined, he was waiting with food he had brought himself rather than calling staff. They ate in silence, the kind of comfortable quiet that came from surviving something terrible together. And afterward, Alexander pulled her against his side on the couch, and they simply breathed together while night deepened outside the windows. Eventually, Eleanor asked what would happen to Drummond, and Alexander said his organization was being dismantled as they spoke, his assets seized, and his remaining men either arrested or persuaded to disappear. And Drummond himself would face federal charges for enough crimes to ensure he never walked free again. She asked if that meant it was truly over, if she was actually safe now, and Alexander's arms tightened around her as he said yes. The immediate threat had ended, though he could not promise his world would ever be completely without danger. Eleanor absorbed that truth, understanding she was choosing a life that would always carry shadows and risks, and realized she had already made peace with it because the alternative was losing him, losing this connection they had forged through fire and fear and reluctant trust. She turned in his arms to face him properly and told him she could not go back to her old life, that too much had changed, and she had changed, and she saw hope flare in his expression before he carefully controlled it. Alexander asked what she wanted instead, his voice low and careful like he was afraid of her answer. And Eleanor took a breath and said she wanted to stay with him, to build something real in this dangerous world. But she needed him to understand it had to be as partners, as equals, not as something he protected and kept. He looked at her for a long moment, something like wonder softening the hard lines of his face, and then he promised her exactly that, his voice steady with an oath she knew he would die before breaking, and Eleanor believed him absolutely. The weeks that followed moved like water finding new channels, reshaping everything Eleanor thought she understood about herself, and what kind of life she could build from the ruins of her old existence. She woke each morning in Alexander's bed with sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a city she was learning to see through different eyes. No longer just the place where she had taught spelling to third graders and worried about rent, but a complex ecosystem of power and territory that Alexander navigated with the same careful attention she had once given to lesson plans. He insisted she continue teaching and arranged for her to conduct classes online from a secure office in the estate. And watching her work with students who had no idea their teacher now lived in the home of the city's most dangerous man seemed to ground something essential in both of them, a reminder that she had not abandoned who she was, even as she stepped into who she was becoming. Alexander began including her in meetings about the legitimate businesses he was systematically expanding, shipping companies and real estate holdings and investment firms that operated in daylight rather than shadow. And Eleanor discovered she had a talent for seeing inefficiencies and asking questions that made his advisors uncomfortable in productive ways. She proposed using a portion of profits to establish educational foundations in underserved neighborhoods, scholarships and after-school programs that would give kids opportunities beyond the criminal pipeline that fed Alexander's world with desperate recruits. And she watched something shift in his expression as he listened, a recognition that she was offering him a kind of redemption he had stopped believing possible. Marcus recovered from his shoulder wound and treated Eleanor with a respect that felt like acceptance into something she had not realized she was joining. A family bound not by blood, but by loyalty and shared survival. And when Catherine finally visited after weeks of frantic phone calls, Eleanor saw her best friend assess the situation with worried eyes, before apparently deciding that Eleanor looked happier than she had in years, despite the armed guards and the boyfriend who could order deaths with a phone call. The nightmares came sometimes, flashes of gunfire and Drummond's cold eyes, and the moment she had fired a weapon at another human being, and Alexander held her through them without trying to fix what could not be fixed, his presence a steady anchor that said she did not have to carry the weight alone. They learned each other slowly, the careful archaeology of trauma and hope, his childhood in a family where violence was inheritance and love was leverage, her years of loneliness masked as independence, and the loss of parents who had believed she would do something significant with her life. And Eleanor thought maybe this was significant in ways they never could have imagined, choosing connection over safety and building something real in the spaces between danger. On a cold morning, exactly 8 weeks after the cafe, Alexander asked her to walk with him through the estate gardens, and in a quiet corner where early frost silvered the grass, he turned to face her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He did not kneel and he did not offer a ring, but he told her she had saved him in ways that went far beyond blood donation, that she had reminded him what it meant to be human rather than just a function of violence and control, and he wanted to build a life with her as true partners. Equals facing whatever came next together, if she was willing to choose him, knowing all the shadows that choice carried. Eleanor felt tears burn her eyes as she looked at this man who had started as a terrifying stranger and become somehow essential, and she said yes, not because the danger had ended, but because she loved him despite it. Loved the man beneath the armor and the future they could forge together through intention and fierce mutual devotion. And when he kissed her, it tasted like beginning rather than ending, a promise made in full understanding that the road ahead would never be simple. But they would walk it together, two people bound by choice and blood and love, hard won